Where the guarantee comes is that if Ukraine is paying America in the future, they assume that America will guarantee, if not the security of the people of Ukraine, the security of the minerals and the resources that they're hoping to get.
Volodymyr Zelensky finds himself in a not dissimilar position now where he is having to sign up to something that if you would normally say, well, why would I sign a piece of paper like that? Why? Because you have to. It's a mugging by the US president of the Ukrainian president to say, hand everything over to me, otherwise you're going to get it. On Vladimir Putin will get what he wants.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester, that's on February the 24th. And finally to Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of those dates. The link will be in the description below. We're really excited to see you there.
I hear that he's coming on Friday. Certainly it's okay with me if he'd like to. And he would like to sign it together with me. And I understand that's a big deal, very big deal. And I think the American people, even if you look at polls.
The person who's okay for him coming is, of course, Donald Trump speaking at the Oval Office. And the person who'll be coming is Volodymyr Zelensky. It looks like the US and Ukraine have hammered out this minerals deal which America wanted to get its hands on Ukraine's rare minerals.
We are waiting with bated breath to see what the text of this deal actually looks like. At the moment, we're being told there is no security guarantee for Ukraine within it. So how is that going to help Ukraine's future as things stand? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily. And you'll remember how this all kicked off. I mean, what feels like a month ago, but was probably only about 72 hours in Trumpland. Donald Trump had said that after all the money that America had spent on Ukraine's defence, obviously against the Russian aggression of Putin, Ukraine had to pay the money back, and he demanded $500 billion worth of Ukrainian rare earth minerals. In other words, stuff that is deep embedded in the Ukrainian land, in mines that would need to come out of the ground and then be handed over to America as some sort of compensation for the money they've spent on weaponry. Zelensky said, no, I don't think that's going to happen. Trump then called him a dictator, said that actually he shouldn't even be there because he'd, taken away the elections, which is part of the Ukrainian constitution during military action. And what has emerged from what first sounded like an extraordinary, outrageous demand from the US is now starting to morph into something that Zelensky thinks he might be able to work with. And we're going to explain to you now what it involves.
Yeah. I mean, look, as we sit here discussing this, I've got to say there is far more that we don't know than we do.
Yeah.
And, we are waiting to see what this text looks like. Because, frankly, if it doesn't contain firm security guarantees on Ukraine's future, then it really is a case that Donald Trump has pinned an unarmed man against the wall and said, I've got weapons, and unless you take this deal, it's a mugging. It's a mugging by the US president of the Ukrainian president to say, hand everything over to me, otherwise you're going to get it. On Vladimir Putin will get what he wants. And it looks like Zelensky may have had to sign on those terms. Now, apparently there have been negotiations. Apparently there have been concessions. Apparently America will do more about Ukraine's future. But America is still saying it is not sending troops to guarantee Ukraine's future. That will be Europe's job. In which case you might ask, well, why isn't Europe getting some of these rare earth minerals as well?
It's quite a complicated structure, and the FT think that they have seen what they think is the final version of the agreement. Obviously, these things can change minute to minute, but it's all about what they're calling future monetization. So in other words, there would be a fund into which Ukraine would contribute 50% of proceeds of state-owned mineral resources. This includes oil, this includes gas, and all these deposits of critical minerals, lithium, graphite, cobalt, titanium, the rare earths. And I guess Where the guarantee comes is that if Ukraine is paying America in the future, they assume that America will guarantee, if not the security of the people of Ukraine, the security of the minerals and the resources that they're hoping to get. And I don't know whether that is where the security implication lies, that America would want to stop Putin from seizing land that would yield them future monetization, future riches, in other words. And I don't know whether that's enough for the Ukrainian people.
Again, this is what remains to be seen. A lot of this is in land which is covered in mines.
Yeah.
The mines, I'm not talking coal mines.
Landmines.
I'm talking landmines, which are going to blow people up and blow machinery up if people walk on them. And demining a vast area that has been mined takes a very long time. So none of this is going to be instantaneous kind of funds flowing in the moment this deal is signed. This is
10 years, 20 years.
Yeah. The other thing I would say, just going back into history a bit, Britain knows what it's like to negotiate with America when it's the Second World War. Britain hasn't got enough of a navy to fight the Nazi threat. There is the Lend-Lease deal, whereby America gives us a bunch of old rusting hulks of warships that had been decommissioned, and we give America leases for the future on vast tracts of land and bits of empire. And it was an absolutely one-sided deal that Churchill signed at the time, because that's what he needed to do. And Volodymyr Zelensky finds himself in a not dissimilar position now, where he is having to sign up to something. If you would normally say, well, why would I sign a piece of paper like that? Why? Because
You've got no choice.
You've got no choice.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely spot on. So you can start by standing your ground, and you can start by saying, this is ridiculous. Zelensky's clearly not the dictator in this. Why aren't you condemning Russian aggression at the UN, as everyone can see you should? And you can end up saying, well, if this gets us to a place where the war has ended. And I think Zelensky has also said, curiously, we don't want to be freeloaders. Or not Zelensky, but the Ukrainian cabinet has said, we don't want to be freeloaders. We understand that this doesn't come cheap. But I guess the position that Ukraine's always taken is, we are standing the ground here for Europe. If Putin's coming for us, he's coming for you next, Estonia, you next, Poland, you next, possibly Finland, and who knows? I mean, that's how much the conversation has changed, that it's now seen to be Ukraine's fault and Ukraine's duty to pay it back. This is what Trump said yesterday. He thinks Zelensky's going to get a good deal out of this. He would say that, wouldn't he?
What does Ukraine get in return, Mr. President?
$350 billion and lots of equipment, military equipment, and the right to fight on, and originally the right to fight. Look, Ukraine, I will say, they're very brave and they're good soldiers, but without the United States and its money and its military equipment, this war would have been over in a very short period of time. In fact, I was the one that gave the javelins. You remember the famous javelins? That was me. That wasn't Obama. It wasn't Biden. It wasn't anybody else. It was me.
So Donald Trump says it will secure Ukraine's future, but it gives them the right to fight on. I thought we were getting a peace. I thought the whole point was that this was a durable peace deal that would happen at the end of this process. But Donald Trump
does
is talking
fight on
about...
just mean exist, I suppose, like live to fight another day,
Yes.
maybe. I mean, the point he's making about the javelins is a really interesting one, because under Obama's administration, I think it's true, the Americans did not send weaponry to Ukraine because they did not want to inflame the tensions that they thought would lead to
They sent
an all-out war.
blankets and defensive
Right,
stuff, didn't they?
exactly.
Blankets,
and Trump did
torches.
to be fair, Trump did overturn that, and he was like, no, if they need this, we're going to... I think it was a trade. It wasn't a gift. It was a trade. But the point being that Ukraine did have an arsenal with which to fight back. And so that's why he keeps referring to himself as the person who, allowed that, legitimised that in the first place. I mean, look, there is no reference that we know of to US security guarantees. And that is something that Kyiv had originally insisted on in return to agreeing to this deal. So the question is... We're watching with bated breath. It's 1:30 as we record. We understand that Zelensky is going to sign off on the actual, as in say yes to the actual deal sometime today, Wednesday, and he's going to be in the White House on Friday with Trump. So is he just going to have to take it at face value and say, well, I hope they're going to do something for us?
Look, we use the phrase the fog of war. We've got the fog of diplomacy.
The fog of peace.
We've got the fog of peace at the moment, where we had Donald Trump saying yesterday that, there would need to be some form of peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is relaxed about that. He's happy for European peacekeepers to go in. Today we've had Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, describing the possible deployment of peacekeeping troops in Ukraine as empty talk and a deceit. Yeah. So, there is not these widespread agreements of Europeans, of Russians, of Ukrainians, of Americans to get this yet, as we understand it. Now, maybe this is all being negotiated. Maybe nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, to use the old kind of cliches from these, big events that take place before you get the communique.
Yeah, and two things. He's got to get his government to sign it off, because actually he's not a dictator and he does abide by the constitution. He's got to get approval from Ukraine's parliament. Opposition MPs have said they want to have a proper debate about this before they ratify it. And I think that the language is quite useful to understand in this deal, which is the US saying they will back Ukraine's economic development into the future. Now, that is not the same as security, but it is offering, if you like, a secure guarantee of Ukraine's economic future. Is that going to be enough?
Well, I suppose if you have got enormous amounts of American wealth tied up with the success of Ukraine, then that does give Ukraine a certain leverage, saying, do you want all these companies to lose all their money, or maybe US government to lose all their money in a joint venture between the Ukrainian government and the US government? Because presumably that is who it will be between over the extraction of these minerals.
And then America can sell the Ukraine deal to the American people.
It's a great business deal.
Well, it's like Greenland. It's like what Trump wants to do in Gaza with his real estate condos. It's what he wants to do with the Panama Canal. It's what he wants to do with Mi Tierra, the 51st state, Canada. And suddenly it becomes part of this picture, which is nothing is free, America is first, and if you want anything from us, we want something back, bigger and better.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is, I think, what the American people voted for, or over half the American people voted for, in November last year.
Just under half, actually, 49%. We'll be back in a moment with a man who would call himself a former Chief Whip. And it is as sadistic and as masochistic a story as you're likely to hear about the last 4 years of the Conservative Party.
It includes one MP who apparently was stuck in a brothel in Bayswater at 2:45 in the morning and had run out of money, and a departmental spad who went to an orgy and ended up defecating on another person's head.
All that to come.
We are joined in the studio now by Simon Hart, who was the last Conservative Chief Whip, and I can't remember any Chief Whips who've written a book before, but Simon Hart has. He was the Welsh Secretary. He has been at the front row of all the politics that has unfolded over the past decade or so, and has written a book called Ungovernable, which is an extraordinary read. Now, Simon Hart, my first question to you has to be, look, Chief Whips don't write books. What was it that first attracted you about the advance you got from your publisher to make you write one?
Well, I've actually been writing a diary since 2010. And I did so because my kids were quite young back then. And I thought there will be a moment sometime in the future when they were going to say, where have you been for the last 15 years? And I thought my plan was to write something funny and amusing about every day that I was here.
But every kind of, ministerial memoirs we know about, the Chief Whip is the person who hears the confessions, who has to deal with the crises, and is meant to carry those stories to the grave.
Yeah. By the way, I think it's a legitimate position to hold. It's just one actually I decided I don't agree with. And the reason for that is the central question I was trying to sort of ask myself in a way is how we went in the 4.5 years that this book covers, from being unassailable in December 2019, 81 seat majority, to 4.5 years later, total annihilation at the ballot box in July 2024, and 3 very different prime ministers later. And I just thought to myself, we can bury all of the dubious stuff. We can just all be very polite and gentlemanly and not talk about it, or we can actually take a look in the mirror and say, the reason we lost in 2024 wasn't because the election was in July or rather than September. That's a total sideshow. We lost in July 2024 because for some time before that, the nation had just come to the view that our reputation for integrity and our reputation for economic competence had been terminally damaged. And unless we look in the mirror and we address why that is and what we can do about it, we will continue to make that mistake. So that's sort of where I was coming from.
Why did you lose it then? I mean, that 80-seat majority, why was it thrown away? Was it carelessness?
I mean, I have some sympathy, by the way, for Boris Johnson over the whole COVID and pandemic period. But if you read towards the end of that, it was with Partygate and all of the associated noise and news and frustrations which were around at the time, it became pretty obvious that one of the things for which Conservative government gets elected and is in office is because we can turn around to people and say we are a party or a government of integrity. And that, whether or not we agree with the Boris Johnson defence or the outcome or the verdict that he was subject to, is a different thing. But the fact is the nation had decided, let alone quite a few of our colleagues, that we'd passed the point at which that was a legitimate argument. So add to that the next bit, which was obviously Liz Truss's sort of brief stay in Downing Street, where, again, for reasons we can argue about till the cows come home, what happened was the second thing we were well known for, our economic competence, was also damaged. By the time you remove those two things, the two principal reasons people voted Conservative, there was nothing left. We can bury all that and sort of pretend it didn't happen, or we can say, hang on, it did happen. Why did it happen, and what can we do to try and sort of minimise it happening again?
So I'm struck by various passages in the book, and we can come to some of the more lurid maybe in a moment. But, you know, you talk about Boris Johnson. You were one of the last ones to resign when there was that whole avalanche of resignations, and you described the scene. You had been arguing in your diary that you kept that there were various things that Boris had done, and this was terminal, and this was terminal, and he wasn't going to recover from this. You had come to that judgment, yet you stayed in the government, and then you described the scene where you resign, you go in to see him, and you give him a hug. And I wondered, when I read that, didn't you feel fury that Boris had driven you off the cliff, yet you still feel this lingering affection for a guy who was a bit of a wrong-un?
Do you know, it is strange when you put it like that. I remember feeling guilty, actually. I remember feeling that actually I was letting him down. And I was trying to explain to him in the very friendly terms, probably the most friendly meeting I ever had with him. And I remember sort of thinking, you know, because I'd left it late, you're right. You know, I was 54 out of 56 or something, I think, third one in the cabinet, but nonetheless. And I just remember thinking, you know, I sort of feel I'm being ungrateful here almost.
So let me follow up with that, because if there is still that affection, and I can hear it in your voice for him, even though Partygate, even though Pincher, even though everything else that happened, you still feel that this was a guy who had something extra. Do you think the Conservative Party still feels that, and that he could come back?
The trouble is, do you remember the expression at the time was, you know, Boris got the big calls right, and that was the line we were using to sort of defend some of the other stuff going on and the noise in the background. And I remember thinking really clearly at the time, yeah, the trouble is, that's fine when you're in any other role but this one. When you're a Prime Minister, the small calls matter too. You have to get the small calls right and the big calls right. And yeah, Boris, a very charming, amusing, compelling character. I used to think in my mind, it was a bit like watching, for those old enough to remember, David Gower playing cricket. When he was good, he was really good. But God, he couldn't half annoy you some days by not concentrating and sort of throwing his wicket away pointlessly. And I used to think that about Boris, and he always managed to recover. He always managed to just about get himself back into contention. And you think, oh, maybe it's not as bad as I thought. The question, though,
so going back to my question,
yeah, about whether I personally think, you know, that ship has probably sailed, but I mean, goodness me, we've all been proved wrong so many times now about, you know, political comebacks. Funny enough, despite, you know, some of the comments I make in the book, you know, we have a completely new regime in the Conservative Party now. We have, I think, something like a quarter of the MPs who were elected in July are new. Kemi has got to be given the chance to do as we all know that she can do and we want her to do. And so talking about, there might be some other person who can sort of, come back from the distant past and revive her, I think that's a naive thought. I as I say, even though Kemi and I didn't always have an easy relationship, that was probably my fault rather than hers. We absolutely, she is elected properly in place and doing her best, and we've got to give that time. I learned not to underestimate her.
So I'm going to read you from page 308, one sentence or two sentences maybe. Kemi popped in for a chat about trans stuff. I try, but I cannot find a mutually usable wavelength. She's another one who lives in a permanent state of outrage. It must be so tiring.
Yeah, I say that. I think the outrage is probably with me rather than anything else, because we were the bank that liked to say no in the Whip's office. We were always getting in the way of Secretaries of State's ambitions because we were trying to organise a timetable which didn't always.
But you don't make her sound very appealing to the British public when you write that.
No, okay. I mean, Margaret Thatcher used to say that I think every day was a fight. Every day was a fight. I think to succeed in politics, every day has to be a fight. You have to be angry. I think I was probably ill-equipped because I wasn't a particularly angry. I got more angry as time went on, but I don't think there was any downside, if you're Kemi Badenoch or anybody else for that matter, of being angry. It's a sort of prerequisite. Just didn't, for me, I'm a sort of mellow sort of, rather too mellow sort of person. So being permanently angry, I sort of think, God, I'd rather, I don't think I want to go there. But she's the one in the hot seat.
Reckon she'll be there at the end of the year?
Oh yeah, why not? I think you always get people, muttering, and people. And this is one of the things in the book, actually, this sort of temptation for people towards the end of as we got to the election in 2024, there was a sort of muttering in the background, as if all you need to flick your fingers and some other person would suddenly appear from nowhere, and all of the problems of the past would be erased. And it's completely naive. She has got a long, hard slog ahead of her. She knows that better than anybody. And the way I see it is that actually she's not getting buffeted by noise. She's sort of set herself a course, and she's pursuing it pretty vigorously.
Simon, your publishers will love you for some of the anecdotes that you've revealed. I'll read out one to give our listeners a sense. Among today's HR joys is the report that a departmental spad went to an orgy over the weekend and ended up taking a crap on another person's head. To make matters worse, in a separate incident, a House employee went to a party dressed as Jimmy Savile, ended up having sex with a blow-up doll, for which he's been dismissed. Just another day at the office, I guess. What you are describing in this book, for the most part, is a show. I mean, quite literally.
Literally.
But it's about defecators and orgies and drunks and compromised MPs and people calling you up at 2:45 in the morning and saying, rescue me, and somebody else getting into a taxi allegedly and then being charged $3,000 by, I think, what you call an Afghan agent. I mean, if people are reading this or listening to this and they're thinking that these people shouldn't be allowed near a paddling pool, let alone a government, what would be your response?
By the way, I don't think, as we've seen with some of the challenges facing Keir Starmer's Whip's office at the moment with recall motions and
I haven't heard anything like this.
MP being sent to prison. And by the way, I'm not trying to make a party political point, because fundamentally, I think what you've raised. The reason I put it in the book, I know it's sort of worded in a, it looks slightly salacious, but actually, it was more in the category of you couldn't make this up, rather than isn't this funny? Let's have a laugh about a peculiar lifestyle in Westminster. I do think this is, again, there's a fundamental question here about how we attract, recruit, train, mentor, support candidates.
But do you think it actually happens once they become MPs? Do you think it actually happens inside the Palace of Westminster?
Well, I think listen, the most of the people I experienced in Parliament and still do are decent people trying to do a decent job, and who occasionally a catastrophe befalls them or somebody in their on their payroll or whatever it might be. It's not always malice aforethought. It isn't always people trying to get one over on the electorate. Sometimes there are, as you know, things happen. Even in newsrooms, which you think, oh hell, where did that come from? Now, whether it's more frequent or less frequent in politics, I don't know. All I do know is that we are, basically pulling people in off the street. We're putting them in often quite unusual and high pressurised situations, and basically abandoning them. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. And some of the pickles people get themselves into are possibly unavoidable, but some aren't.
Pickles. I mean,
can I just read one other,
Go
Emily?
on.
Go on. Which is, again, you've said that kind of most MPs are decent, hard-working, straightforward.
I stand by that, yeah.
Yeah. But then why include these stories that make you think, oh my God, they're all a bunch of frigging freaks? I'll just read you the bit.
Yeah.
Me, you get a phone call. You get a phone call at 2:45 in the morning. You say, what's up? I'm stuck in a brothel in Braeswater and I've run out of money. You, go on. Well, I met a woman as I left the Carlton Club who offered me a drink, but I now think she's a KGB agent. She wants 500 quid and has left me in a room with 12 naked women and a CCTV. I mean, that doesn't...
I know. Listen, I think that
isn't that
it's there. Well, it's there because actually I suspect we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't there in the book. The reason that we did, in a sense, so badly in 2024 as a party and as a government isn't because Rishi Sunak wasn't a very decent and hard-working guy, or wasn't because of the date of the election. It's because of the Tory psychodrama, the psychodrama that accompanied us for rather too long in the final few years of our period in office, and which basically wore out what was left of public patience.
Didn't that psychodrama come from the top, though? I mean, once you've looked at how Boris Johnson acts and behaves in private or in public, isn't everyone thinking, well, that's fine, this is a free ticket for me?
But, I mean, that's why I was so enthusiastic in my support for Rishi Sunak, because I thought there was a chance that we could, inject some, decency and sort of common sense back into the equation. I suspect by the time his regime got in place, it was too late. I mean, we went to a 20-point poll deficit in the second week of Truss, and we never really recovered that at all. And so part of the example is to say, look, it was probably a clunky way of being able to say, look, it doesn't matter how hard Rishi tried or how much he did the right thing for the right reason. Against those kind of headwinds, it was very difficult to persuade the public that we were worthy of a fifth term, which, by the way, nobody had ever done before anyway.
You don't think you were worthy, do you?
I think we could have been. I think we could have been. I think we were. I think he was. And I maintain that it could have been done. But in the end, politics is cyclical, isn't it? And I think that looking back now, from with the benefit of hindsight, I think there was the public view was that do you know what, somebody else's turn now. And people, when I was campaigning in the election, people were feeling sorry for me rather than angry with me.
So you speak very highly of Rishi Sunak in the book. You're obviously very warm towards Boris Johnson as well, which we've kind of talked about. I mean, there's a line where you say, their styles are so different that I've decided that when it comes to politics, Boris fucks and Rishi makes love. Both are strangely effective. I mean, can you just sort of... I mean, it's a great visual metaphor.
Not sure it is.
Is that great? No, frankly. Yeah, maybe it's slightly repellent. But what do you mean?
I mean, first of all, don't forget this is a diary, and I try to remain faithful to the idea that a diary is what you felt on the day, at the end of something, which a period of time which might have been trying, it's meant to reflect anger, passion, frustration, exasperation, joy, whatever the emotion of the day was. And so, of course, will some people approve of that kind of use of language? Possibly. I don't think my mother would, for one. I'm dreading her reading it. But what I wanted to...
This is a safe space, by the way, on the news agents to swear, so you're fine.
Well, I don't know if my mum listens, but anyway, I was trying to make the point that Boris is totally different. Boris would arrive at a meeting, his shirt would be all over the place, his papers would be all over the place, there'd be hair all over the place, and he wouldn't necessarily know who he was going to be meeting, or even necessarily what the topic was going to be. But it sort of worked. And I were many meetings with him where people warmed to that and they found it interesting and different and, didn't know what was going on. Rishi, totally different. He would have read the brief. He would have understood the brief. He would have cross-examined the brief. He would have known who he was going to meet and why. He would have known the policy area. I remember being told several times by Liam Booth-Smith, his chief of staff, if ever I was going to talk to him about a sort of a particular challenge government face, he just said, make sure you've got your facts right.
There are lots of cosy chats in this book with journalists like us. When you read it, you start to kind of go, God, all that stuff that was denied at the time, it was all denied to us, And
everything was true.
And it was all true. Do you have a guilt about that this is doing something to the fabric of our whole political discourse? How you say things are not true to shut down a story for your party's sake, which we then have to relay to the public, who then turn out not to trust us.
Yeah. One of the things which I don't think, by the way, the Whip's office should be responsible for is, as a department, the department of covering up. Yeah. And I don't think that's what people go into the Whip's office to do. Ultimately, our job is to get government business done and get legislation on the statute book. That's what we're there for, and that's what people are. That's where their skill set is. So I think there is a downside from basically pulling the wool over commentators' eyes, which subsequently can be unpulled and identified. We have to go back to the fact that we lost the 2024 election so spectacularly for reasons which were way beyond, whether our Rwanda legislation was going to work or whether which we chose the right month of the year to have the election, whatever it might have been. It is much more fundamental than that. And if we're going to rely, as we should, on a sort of democratic process by which candidates are identified and selected, then the very least we can do is to make sure that there is a system in place which gives them the best chance of success. I mean, I thought it always sort of was odd during reshuffles, for example, that you would pluck somebody off the backbenches and put them into a department with several thousand employees and arm's length bodies and stakeholders, a multi-billion-pound budget, without a day's training. So off you go. You're starting. By the way, at 6 o'clock, you're doing the media round tomorrow morning. Towards you, I think one of the reasons I sort of parted company with Boris in the end is I think I did 6 media rounds when I was Welsh Secretary. Not one of them did I actually talk about policy. All of them were about defending Partygate.
I just wonder, kind of as you reflect on this, whether you think that things have got worse. You call the book Ungovernable, and whether we're just reaching a stage in our society because of social media, because of other pressures, whatever it happens to be, that politicians are held in very low esteem, journalists not much better, or maybe even worse, where the public do not support you. Do you think that we are on a linear path where we become increasingly ungovernable, or would Trollope be writing about the same things however many years ago?
I don't know. I was just struck by how quickly after the July election the venom was turned on the new Labour government. I just seem to recall when I was younger that there would have been a little bit of space given for the government to find its feet and to work out what government was like. I got the impression that there was about 15 minutes of equivalent of 15 minutes of, right, you got your chance, solve NHS waiting list, achieve peace in Ukraine, improve my standard of living.
And if you can't do it by then,
and if you can't do it, thanks very much. Right, who's next? You're useless. The last guys were useless. Let's have a look over. Oh, look, there's reform. Let's try them for a bit, see how that works. And I think that there's a risk of being of sort of expectation management here, and that people will be consistently disappointed in their politicians. And I think that might drive people to, God knows what will drive them to, possibly drive them into not voting at all. In my patch last in July, the turnout went down to 59%. That's not much better than the local authority election from normally 75. That's a terrible situation to be in.
Simon Hart, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Funny thing about that interview was he was talking about the sort of painfulness of doing the morning round where you had to and I thought there was something about that in this interview, where in the book there are these fantastically lurid stories, really kind of sharp criticism of various characters, and he comes in to do the interview on the book and says, well, Kemi is much more formidable, and kind of walks away from the criticisms that he's made in the book, which was just, he was still a minister on the rounds.
I mean, let's be honest, we're all really scratching our heads after that interview, because on the one hand, you have these incredible lurid accounts of what is often the old boys club getting up to seriously grubby, seedy behaviour. It's kind of presented as hilarious. And then it's not justified. It's kind of like, oh, look in the mirror. What must we do to ourselves to stop doing more of this? It's pretty obvious. Like, stop doing it. Just stop doing it. Don't do it.
Don't crap on other people's heads.
Don't crap on other. Don't go to a party dressed as Jimmy Savile. Don't start bringing people into the party who seem to reflect exactly those kind of values because they find it all quite funny, including probably having Boris Johnson at the top, who would find it hilarious. I ended up feeling we've kind of followed our tail round in a circle and actually come out none the wiser.
Well, I also thought that if the aim of the book is to make people realise that government is good and it's full of decent people, and you've got all these stories of, people going to brothels and running out of money, then you're not going to achieve that goal. You're going to confirm the worst suspicions that we have of our politicians, that it's a bit of a game.
But he wants to sell a book. You wouldn't have read a book about virtuous people doing clever things.
But then don't be surprised if at the end of this people think, oh, God, I thought so.
Yeah, they're all a bunch of wrong-uns.
We'll be back after this. So a moment ago, Emily, you were talking about Trump's plans for Greenland, Trump's plans for the Panama Canal and Canada, and of course, Gaza. And on Truth Social today, Donald Trump has posted a video that he likes of what Gaza will look like in the future. And blimey, it is extraordinary in so many ways.
Donald's coming to set you free, bringing the light for all to see. No more tunnels, no more fear. Trump Gaza is finally here. Trump Gaza shining bright.
It is a cross between the kind of video that's playing in a hotel when you get to the room and there's a video of the hotel itself on the loop, very glossy and sort of soft focus, and one of those sort of welcome to the Middle East sort of promotional videos that they sometimes show on a plane on landing. And the point about it is you can sort of get swept along with it until you suddenly realise that he's talking about Gaza, a place that 2 million, nearly, Palestinians call their home, which has been transformed into a gold-plated, beachified, Trump hotel-dominated part of the Middle East.
Well, it's called Trump Gaza, with Trump hotels everywhere. You see Elon Musk. The video starts with kids walking through rubble, and then the rubble turns into hotels, and you see Elon Musk eating a great meal, and you see money falling from the sky and kids' hands reaching up to touch it. You see Netanyahu on a sun lounger by the pool.
With Trump.
With Trump. It is, insensitive doesn't begin to describe it. Unbelievable, that Gazans are probably still, hungry, trying to find food, and you have a video like that, kind of jokey video of what Trump's Gaza would look like.
We're going to be talking about this in a bit more detail on the News Agents USA, and you can find us on that separate feed. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.